Thanks so much. So, welcome everybody. We're really delighted to have all of you here to share the next hour and a half with us. And we're grateful to you for making time at this busy moment in our lives. It seems that November is always a chaotic time for everybody. So, we're very glad to have you with us. So, welcome. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I work on the shared traditional territory of the Neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and not to engage in conflict. The principles, as I learned from an Oneida elder, are to only take what you need, leave enough for others, and clean the dish. These principles guide how I try to live my life and do my work as a food scholar, and I hope can inform your work and lives as well. So welcome to this webinar. It is hosted as part of our Food Learning and Growing Flow Partnership, which is a 7-year research project that aims at enhancing regional food systems through innovative research and collaboration. Our mission is to map and monitor how various practices impact social, environmental, and economic factors to build just, equitable, and circular food systems. By connecting with a diverse network of researchers, practitioners, community partners, and policymakers, we aim to create impactful, indicator-driven narratives that drive meaningful change. It's important to note that this is an international partnership. The partnership brings together 10 regional research teams from across Canada and around the world. Our partners come from Brazil, Mexico, Kenya, Australia, Sri Lanka, and India, as well as in Canada, in Vancouver, up in the Northwest Territories, Ottawa, and in Montreal. And each team is composed of both academic and community partners. Since beginning the project, we've evolved to have 2 communities of practice that work on core themes. The first is around agroecology, and the second around city-region food systems. And the second theme is the focus of today's webinar, where we are going to be featuring the projects in the City Region Food Systems Group as they tell their stories of regional change. So Liz, I'll hand it over to you now for some housekeeping details.
For sure. Thanks, Allison. So just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded. And for that reason, we will just keep everyone's microphones off and cameras off so that we can feature the speakers. We do have capacity for translations and captioning. And I have a few slides here to help navigate how to find that. So on the bottom of the toolbar, you should be able to find the More button and selecting this to find captions. And then following the captions button, you can then turn on translations. You can choose between different languages for whichever is the language that you're hoping to view the captions in, and a pop-up window should allow you to select this from the list. And this is just another example of what that should look like. And I'll go back to the slide here. And so the order of the event today is we will have our speakers first from Australia, which is Rachel Carey and Maureen Murphy. Then we'll move to Montreal featuring Annalisa and Anne-Marie. And then we'll have our speakers from Ottawa, which is Mo and Patricia. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with Vancouver Island, and Kent will be presenting on behalf of the team from Vancouver Island. And then we'll move into a moderated discussion period, then followed by reflections from our special guest, Anne Palmer. And we're so happy that everyone is able to participate in this full webinar today. If you have any questions during the webinar, please direct them to the chat, and we'll use that space for the audience Q&A, which will happen at the last 30 minutes or so of the webinar. So that's all the housekeeping I have. I'll pass it back over to you, Allison. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to give you a little bit of context before we hand it over to our amazing panelists. This work that you're going to be hearing about builds on projects by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and RUAF that was funded in part by GIZ out of Germany and included participation from Wilfrid Laurier University and the University of Melbourne. So it's a very wide-reaching project in its foundations. And as you're going to hear, there really is no one definition of what regional is, but rather multiple place-based definitions and versions. And that's really the essence, or one of the essences of what you're going to hear about today. For example, city region food systems can be defined using the longstanding work of Mullinix and others as a bioregion, or building on the insights into where our food comes from and food flows through the work of food sheds that Kloppenberg did in terms of how food flows from farm to fork. And what these food systems share, this is an important note, is that they're all looking to localize connections between eaters and producers in ways that are reciprocal, collaborative, sustainable, and just. And as Clancy and Ruff put it, regional food systems in the end are greater than the sum of their locals. And this is really what we're getting at with the Flow Research Project, is unpacking how, as a region, we are more impactful than individual community-based projects. And key features are that come out of this work are the opportunities for a territorial or regional focus for food system flows, the increased circularity of resources within the region. Multi-scale policy coherence is also important in terms of supporting transformation through equitable, resilient food systems. There's also can be more attention to food security and nutrition by being closer to community health and well-being realities and needs. And really, the region is the scale where transformation to a more resilient and just food system seems to be taking place. And all of these factors act as a source of resistance to the dominant industrial globalized food system. And that's really the perspective that we bring to the table when we're doing our work through the Flow Partnership. So as Liz explained, today we're going to be hearing from 4 of our partners. Everyone's going to be sharing their perspectives and experiences of working at the regional scale, and we'll be talking about what regional food systems mean in their context. We're also going to be exploring the challenges and the benefits of regionally specific food systems, looking at practical insights, and also hearing about some inspirational stories that are driving meaningful food systems change. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel and Maureen, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liz and Alison. I'm just going to share my screen here, share a few slides with you. Hopefully, hope that looks okay. Wonderful. So I'm Rachel Carey, and I co-lead the Flow project in Melbourne with my colleague Maureen Murphy, who will also be presenting, and Tara Bean is also a part of our team here. And I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded lands that we're all joining from, and by paying respects to their elders. And this image is from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, on which the University of Melbourne's main campus stands. And I'm joining you from the lands of the Boon-wurrung people. And I particularly want to acknowledge the importance of traditional custodianship of country to regional food systems that are sustainable, equitable, and resilient, and also pay respects to any First Nations colleagues who are joining us here today. So Melbourne is a city of over 5 million people on the coast of southeast Australia, and the area shaded in blue is the region that we think of as being Melbourne's city region food system, or the city's food bowl as we tend to refer to it. And we defined Melbourne's regional food system in this way around 10 years ago when we started a project called the Foodprint Melbourne Project, which involves local governments, including the City of Melbourne and other food system stakeholders. And the project is funded by the Greater Melbourne Foundation. And we defined the region with stakeholders as the region that they understand to include both urban and peri-urban Melbourne. So this region, as we've defined it, is based on local or municipal government boundaries, and it extends in a radius of around 100 kilometres from the city. It has 2 peri-urban rings that include important areas of food production around the city, and the inner ring is Greater Melbourne, which is inside the metro boundary. And Melbourne's regional food system is part of a larger regional food system in the state of Victoria. And of course, we also have other city food systems of larger regional cities in the state as well. So why do we work at the regional scale? We work at this scale because it allows us to consider the relationship between the city and the food producing areas in its hinterland in an integrated and circular way, and also to encourage collaboration between actors across all stages of the food system, and to encourage policy approaches to strengthen the resilience of the city's food system to sudden shocks and underlying stresses. And that includes approaches like protecting farmland on the fringe of the city, strengthening regional food supply chains, and recycling city wastewater and food waste to reuse on farms. And this is an infographic that we developed a few years ago to communicate this vision. And I'm going to hand over to Maureen now.
Thanks, Rachel. If we can move, yeah. So what story would you tell about your region? In Victoria, we live in a world that is experiencing drying and warming climate, and it's vulnerable to droughts and bushfires. Bushfires are increasing in their intensity and frequency. As well as these climate shocks and stresses, our food systems are impacted by multiple and co-occurring global shocks such as pandemic and geopolitical conflicts. Together, these have contributed to rising food prices and food insecurity in Australia. So our research in the FLOW project aims to foster regional level collaboration between key stakeholders and local governments in Melbourne City region to build resilient food systems. We're focused on regional governance and the development of regional level indicators to track progress towards equitable, sustainable, healthy, and resilient food systems. Why is this important? In Australia, along with many other parts of the world, shocks and stresses are leading to rising food prices and food insecurity. So this is some recent population health data that shows prevalence of food insecurity across Australia, but we know that some households are doing it tougher than others. As well as the data presented here, Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows us that more than 4 in 10 Aboriginal households experienced food insecurity in 2022. So what's this story? What are we doing? What's happening to address these issues? Against this backdrop of shocks and stresses to food systems, we see a range of organisations working to address these issues. These are examples of civil society initiatives that we've documented in our reports about initiatives that are working at local scale and regional scale to build healthy, equitable, sustainable and resilient food systems. We're also seeing many local governments in Victoria are adopting standalone food system policies and participating in new regional level food partnerships, including our 3 FLOW local government partners. So from little things, big things grow. So I'd like to hand back to you, Alison.
Thank you so much for that wonderful overview of what's going on in Australia, in particular in Melbourne. And the idea of the rings around the city, I think that's something many people can identify with. And also, unfortunately, with the stresses and from economic conditions as well as climate change. So thank you for that very fast-moving overview of what's going on in your region. Annalisa and Anne-Marie, over to you, please.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, please.
And while Annalisa is sharing her screen, I should note that in the chat, you will find the bios for all of our speakers. So please don't hesitate to check those out. I encourage you to do so.
So we're going to start with Anne-Marie in our presentation, but before that, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded territory of the Kanikahage Nation, which is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a traditional meeting place here in Montreal. And we try and live and work in the spirit of that relationship and in relationship to the land. And with that, I will pass it over to Anne-Marie, who's going to be starting our presentation. Tell me when you want me to advance, Anne-Marie.
Yes, please advance. Thank you, Annalisa. So it's interesting to hear about how other regions have a collective process that leads to the definition of what their regional food system will be, how it will be defined, because in our case, it's very different. Our region is defined by the provincial government. So in Quebec, in the province of Quebec here in Canada, there are 17 administrative regions, of which Montreal, or the island of Montreal, is one. So that part is actually fairly straightforward for us. Where it gets complicated is the divisions within our region. So we have 19 boroughs in the city of Montreal, as well as 15 independent municipalities that are separate from the city of Montreal, but which are all brought together in an agglomerate. We have a population of over 2 million people, so it's the most dense region in the province. And I guess where the official boundary of our region starts to break down a bit, or we begin to question it, is because while there is an important urban agriculture movement here in Montreal and urban farms are present, definitely for the major part of our sustenance, we rely on food that comes from elsewhere, and in particular, the productive regions around the city of Montreal. And those regions, while they have their own administrative identities, in terms of the food basket, remains loosely defined. Could switch the slide out, Lisa. So why we work at this scale? Well, in part because we do have a mandate that comes to us from the provincial government to work on the promotion of access to healthy food. So this is one of the sort of official basis of our work. It's a mandate that we have that comes from the provincial government in the context of their health promotion and prevention policy. At the same time, we also have a mandate with the city of Montreal, so that covers the entire territory that we work in, but on the municipal level. So our mandate is to be a food policy council for the city of Montreal, to provide advice on in terms of food policy. The Conseil SAM, the Conseil du Système Alimentaire Montréalais, which is the Food Policy Council for Montreal, also plays a role of convener, of knowledge sharing, and of helping structural initiatives emerge and scale up within our region. So we work with a vast number of leaders and organizations across sectors, and we come together around an integrated action plan in which many different partners will be running their own projects, but it's all brought together within the framework of this regional integrated action plan. Over to you, Annalisa.
Okay, great. While the mandate actually for the Conseil du Système Alimentaire Montréalais comes from the government, and the administrative region is defined by the government, it is also the case that it is the product of movement and action since the 1980s and 1990s on two different fronts, focused on food security and urban agriculture. Within the neighborhoods in Montreal, for example, in the context of an economic downturn and the stresses associated with that during the 1980s, tables at the local level actually started getting together and coordinating with one another to focus on feeding the population and people who were really hurting. Beginning in the 1990s and then coalescing around the year 2000 and the 2010s, there was also a big movement of urban agriculture in Montreal. And these actually fed the process associated with the Montreal food system and the development of the Conseil SAM. Since 2010, there's been a multi-stakeholder network on food, but there was no formal governments until 2018. And there were various food movement organizations that coalesced and identified the need for a formal food policy council. So the pressure was both from below and from above in terms of actually the development of the food policy council. The city held consultations and adopted a resolution to create the Food Policy Council from that process, and then the council officially launched in 2018. So it was a bit of a longer process, but at the same time, it benefited from the voices of people who were at the neighborhood level, and also the people who saw the need from externally from the level of the administrative region. And that is that. So I will hand it back to you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Annalisa and Anne-Marie, for giving us that overview. It's now we're moving to Ottawa with Trish and Mo, who are going to talk about the region of Ottawa. Are you okay for your slides, or do you? Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. So this first slide is just a quick one to situate Ottawa, Ontario, Canada for any of our international colleagues on this webinar. and to acknowledge that both Just Food and Carleton University are situated on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Nation. You'll see our core Ottawa Region team, myself, Trish Balamingi. I'm a professor of geography and environmental studies at Carleton University. My colleague, Irina Knezovich, who's a professor of communication studies, and Mo Garahan, who is the executive director of Just Food, and also the partnership coordinator for both Common Ground, which is an organization that links academics coast to coast to coast, and Food Communities Network, linking community groups coast to coast to coast. And she is also, quite fortunately, our community partner on this grant. Slide. So Just Food, or Alimentation Juste, is a local nonprofit community-based organization that works on both rural and urban food and farming issues in Ottawa and surrounding region. This civil society organization is unique in that it works towards food access and sustainable agriculture in tandem to build vibrant, just, and sustainable food and farming systems, and it does so through a food systems lens. Most of the work that Just Food engages in takes place within the city of Ottawa, but the group is active at several different scales, including regionally, which we'll talk about, involving adjacent counties that would be considered part of the Ottawa Foodshed or buy local region of Eastern Ontario and Western Quebec, also provincially and federally, coast to coast to coast. So in other words, the organization is punching above its weight in terms of policy impact, food systems leadership, and piloting innovative practices that others can emulate and adapt to their local context. Just Food strives to achieve its goals using community development and community economic development approaches, fostering partnerships among all participants in the food cycle from seed to compost. Now, slide. In terms of Just Food's definition of local, for the purposes of its Savor Ottawa Buy Local region, this includes the cities of Ottawa and Gatineau and neighboring counties. So Savor Ottawa uses the widely accepted definition of local food as coming from within the same jurisdiction where the food is being sold or from the surrounding jurisdictions. This definition runs counter to the current 10-year supposedly interim policy of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that views local food as food produced in a province or territory in which it is sold, or from within 50 kilometers across the border of the originating province or territory. In a region where the urban center, in this case Ottawa-Gatineau, spans a provincial border, and farmers have historically freely marketed to eaters on either side of that border, from a systems perspective, it makes no sense to allow a provincial border to, artificially shape your definition of a buy local region. So in terms of why Just Food works at this scale, work at this regional scale builds on popular historical notions of a food shed, so the geographical region from which a population is sourcing its food. It further builds on concepts such as the bioregion, defined by characteristics of the natural environment, and local food miles, the distance foods traveled from where it's produced to where it's sold or consumed. People understand these notions intuitively, and working at this scale builds directly on these formulations. Because Just Food adopts a food systems approach, it's continually looking for interconnections between the supply chain and the value chains. Working at the regional scale, encompassing urban and rural, allows the organization to leverage locals for regional impact. Slide, please. One story we would like to tell about our region is that Ottawa is an agricultural city. The city boundaries there are spanning about 45 kilometers. Within those city boundaries, there are 1,000+ farms, and Ottawa itself is situated within the National Capital Region, which itself has significant amounts of green space and agricultural land. The city has great potential to become a national leader in establishing sustainable food systems due to its municipal governance structures and natural resources. And there are other stories that we could tell with more time. The Savor Ottawa story, more specifically, as an example of an intentionally developed and carefully crafted narrative. The story around the plant strategy, which is a strategy that advocates for the right to grow food in good soil with raised beds in our city. The campaign to influence the mayor of Ottawa and city council to sign on to the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. the story of why a food systems facilitator role is so critical and sometimes difficult to fund, what it means to take policies one by one, build in a food systems lens, identify local levers, and focus on being part of broader networks. So if these are of interest to you, then, and please, we would encourage you on this last slide to check out and find out more at justfood.ca. Thank you.
Thanks for that really excellent overview, Trish. You've given us lots of things to ask about in the Q&A, and it's a rich food story that you have going on in the Ottawa region. Kent, are you okay to go next?
I am. Thank you, Allison.
Okay, over to you.
Very good. We are working in BC to advance bioregional food systems, and the bioregion that we are currently focused on is the Vancouver Island bioregion. Vancouver Island is the largest island off of the North American Pacific coast. Bioregions we define as areas that are they're geographically defined areas that share similar topography and plant and animal life, and importantly, human culture. The boundaries of these bioregions and Vancouver Island bioregions are a little fuzzy. So, Vancouver Island bioregion also includes perhaps some of the mainland coast that culturally identifies with the island, and some proximal smaller islands. Ultimately, when we delineate a bioregion like Vancouver Island bioregion, we defer to political jurisdictions called regional districts in British Columbia, and Vancouver Island has 7 regional districts, and they comprise numerous communities. Interestingly, these bioregions, in our experience in BC, approximate traditional, indigenous traditional territories, like the one I am coming from, the Sioux Nation territory. So, as I said, Vancouver Island's the largest island off the coast of west coast of North America. It is approximately 460 kilometers long and averages about 100 kilometers wide. For comparison, that's about the size of Belgium or Taiwan, or the size of Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire combined. So it's a large island. It's about an hour and a half ferry ride from the sailing from the lower mainland in Vancouver to the island. And all of the goods that come to the island have to be shipped on ferry, either provincial ferry or a private ferry. So it is, in that respect, quite isolated. There's one way in and one way out for goods, and that includes food. The population is about 900,000 people. It's concentrated in the provincial capital of Victoria in the southern part of the island, which is the southernmost portion of Canada. And it is just above Seattle, maybe about an hour's drive from Seattle. So but there are also on the island many remote communities with one road in and one road out. And the climate is mild, described as a Mediterranean climate. It's warm and sunny because of the rain shadow of the Olympic uh, mountains in Washington State. Plenty of precipitation during the growing season, and the winters are mild and wet, typical of the Pacific Northwest. Um, there's a lot of agriculture on the island. There is in BC the Agricultural Land Reserve. Through legislation, all agriculture land is designated in the province. On Vancouver Island, there's about 117,000 hectares of land in the Agricultural Land Reserve. Interestingly, only about a third of that is farmed, 52,000 hectares. There are multiple reasons for the limited cultivation. Most notably is the cost. The cost of agriculture land in British Columbia and certainly in this bioregion far exceeds what most agricultural endeavors could service. Nonetheless, this land is very important. In BC, only 4% of the land base is arable. And so we consider this natural resource to be precious and essentially non-renewable. And so the support of maintaining an agricultural land reserve is really important to people here.
Thank you, Kent.
Yep.
Oh, you're all good? Okay,
Yep, I'm
awesome.
good.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for sharing how you define your region, your regional food system focused on different political boundaries, but also in concert with your communities and the interaction that's happening in terms of where the food comes from, the producers and the farmers, and the relationships with the eaters. So that gives us a really great overview of what your regional food systems look like. What we'd like to do now is to dig a little bit more into the pluses and minuses of working in these food systems. So the first thing that I'd like to do is ask you all to speak to the benefits of working regionally. And I think we'll just go in the same order as the presenters. So Rachel and Maureen, if you want to get started, that would be much appreciated. Over to you.
I'll kick off and Rachel might jump in. But one of the things that our partners talk about is that the food system and food flows don't stop at any municipal boundaries, that we're part of the food supply chains, extend, and where our food comes from and where the people who eat the food comes from is way more than a municipal boundary. So there's some of the things that set the region, but also it's around our ecosystems that, again, ecosystems which underpin our whole food system don't have geographic boundaries on them. What we're also seeing at the moment too, like in quite a pragmatic manner of things, is that funding streams at the moment in Victoria are partly regionally based. So that's also suggesting a direction for our partner organisations in order to access the funding. They need to be working and thinking regionally. So there's some of the benefits. Both like environmental, economic, but also this funding sort of stuff that's happening at the moment.
Great, thanks for sharing that. Rachel, did you have anything you wanted to add, or?
Yeah, I guess I would just also add briefly that I think in the context of the increasing shocks and stresses that we've been seeing here in the Melbourne region that Maureen talked about before, that there's just growing recognition of how vulnerable city food systems and food supplies are, and that really working on strengthening those regional food supply chains between those producers on the fringe of the city and those businesses and eaters within the city is something that's seen as being increasingly important, and working at regional level allows us the opportunity to do that. So I think there's growing policy recognition of the need to do that at all levels of government, actually.
Sounds like funding opportunities as well, which oftentimes go hand in hand with the policy. So, okay,
Right.
Great. Thank you for that. Annalisa and Anne-Marie, what are the benefits of working at the regional scale, or are there any in the Montreal, on the island of Montreal?
Absolutely. As you mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, one of the challenges that we face in Montreal is the diversity of all of the smaller levels of work that happen at the neighborhood level, and the multiple municipalities that we have within this region. At the same time, working on this somewhat limited territory, and as it's defined by the provincial government, makes it really clear to actors across a variety of sectors that we do have this place in common. And so that if we want to work on food issues or other issues that are connected, like housing issues, for example, well, it's just kind of more intuitive that, well, it makes sense for us to be working together across sectors, across various interests, people who are working on food insecurity, people who are working on reducing our carbon footprint. It just still makes sense, even though there's a diversity of interests and a diversity of issues, that we would work together because we're sharing this place. So I think that's an important element. And I think the other thing is that by conforming to the very official definition that is given to us by the provincial government, well, it also affords us a certain recognition as spokespeople for our region. So in Quebec, we have a lot of things that are a lot of jurisdictions that remain at the provincial level that in other places around the world belong to municipalities and cities or local health boards. So for example, school food programs are run by the Ministry of Education provincially, and they don't have any very little autonomy at the municipal level. And so a lot of the programs, funding, and decision-making power is at the provincial level, and by working at the regional level, which is recognized by the province, then we have better recognition also as the spokespeople for what the needs of our region are.
Excellent, thanks. Those are really interesting insights. Mo and Trish, can you talk to us about the benefits of using a regional lens in the Ottawa region, please?
Can do. Thanks for that, everyone. So benefits that we're finding of working at a local regional level in the Algonquin-Ottawa region is that effects of food systems are acutely felt by people living at the community local level. So the downstream effects of government policy is visibly seen at the local regional level among our neighbors. And this really, I find, has translated to a feeling of greater urgency and higher motivation of residents, groups, and local governments to work on systems change. So this can translate to greater motivation to use the multiple levers available, innovating around multi-department approaches. I feel like it's been shown to be a location that maybe can best integrate multi-jurisdictional policies, even as we push upwards for similar systems level approaches and policy at other jurisdictional levels. Local regional is also the place where the most innovation happens and where work is more immediately felt as an impact. And this is even recognized at global tables, including FAO's urban agenda work that recognized urban relevance. And this was identified as a first for FAO to work at a sub-national level because of that critical importance of local regional. The work of supporting communities across coast to coast here in Indigenous Territories Canada has been supported through this FLOW project as well. And this is an initiative housed at Just Food. And this storytelling has been critical to learn about the innovations in regional work. And so there's benefit to sharing these stories across us. And a key final benefit that we found of working regionally is that infrastructure investments made into our declining middle of processing and distribution are often only economically viable if done at a regional scale that is supported by region-wide inputs. So that includes community food processing hubs that need to comply with increasingly expensive regulations, or specialized infrastructure like Deep Roots Food Hub that's in our community that supports storage of produce over the winter and summer seasons. Thanks.
Thanks, Mo, for giving us those great examples of where the synergies are in terms of regional food systems. That's really inspiring. Kent, over to you. What are the benefits of working at the bioregional scale for Vancouver Island?
So our thinking is that working at the bioregional scale presents a scale large enough to actually think about the possibility of creating a whole robust food system, and that sometimes more local focus precludes. And so we can posit it the development of a bioregional food system in terms of having great economic and community development potential, much like Bo was saying. We think at that level you can have a better chance of attracting finance to help build the missing middle, all the post-production uh, capacity that's needed for a food system. And importantly to us, we believe that the food system, like other aspects of the human economy, but especially the food system, needs to be linked to the ecology of place. People need to start thinking in those terms, and we've got to organize and operate our economies in concert with the ecology of place.
Thanks very much, Ken, for raising the flag for ecosystems. That's very much appreciated and really apt that we would talk about those in the context of our regional food systems. And those summative comments about the benefits for the economies as well. And we seem to be hearing that across the board, and also for opportunities in terms of funding and appropriate scale policy initiatives, and also the place where communities come together and can bring about transformative change together at a meaningful scale. So those are the good things, some of the good things. I'm now going to ask each of you to talk about some of the challenges that you face. And I know that there are many, but you only have 2 minutes each. So I think we'll go in reverse order this time, if that's okay. Kent, I'm going to turn it over to you first, and then we'll go Ottawa, Montreal, excuse me, and give Rachel and Maureen the last word.
Okay, well, I'll be quick. First, yeah, unusual, I know. First, people have trouble envisioning the possibility of actually creating a robust food system at a regional scale or local scale. Um, Also, we have difficulty getting municipal governments and regional district governments to actually work together to create a food system. They're not used to it. They work on their own. And to build a bioregional food system of the scale we're talking about, you actually have to get traditional political jurisdictions to work together and to make things happen. And then lastly, I would say um, provincial agriculture food system policy and, in my estimation, Canadian federal agriculture and food system policy are not working in alignment with building regional food systems. They're focused on GDP and large scale transnational business development. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ken. Over to Ottawa, Mo.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, so challenges. The first one I want to bring up is related to organizing processes. So there's still a real lack of understanding of a food systems approach, with a common view being that held that food insecurity, as one example, must be focused on first, with food systems work nice to have afterwards, as opposed to understanding the requirement for integrated systems work in order to effectively deal with these complex challenges. And so that ubiquitous nature of the food system that's connected to virtually everything, in conjunction with siloed political decision making that currently includes cuts to do more with less, and an unwillingness to take on something that feels big and integrated and complex and maybe fully beyond a departmental mandate, leads to government departments not taking on their actual part of the puzzle, and can lead to a resistance of government actors to accept that civil society expertise might be the most effective in a lead facilitation role on the required collective impact processes that we do need to bring about effective action. And this facilitation needs to be adequately funded. So then just the second one I would say is facilitation of urban-rural linkages is a really big challenge that we face, particularly in Indigenous Territories Canada, where the population in rural areas is very low compared to urban centers. As we experience those challenges with supply chains, we increasingly have challenges with good food in urban centers, but urban centers do not use our voices to prioritize things like farmland protection. We need regional food production and seed sovereignty and farmland succession and infrastructure investments that were already talked about. We need all these things to be supported by urban centers. And that only happens with really strong urban rural linkages and a strong, well-informed urban voice for investing in viable regional food production and processing capacity. Thanks.
Thanks, Mo. Yeah, you're raising a really important point. If we don't want to have a global food system, we need to have a regional one. So this work is really important, and convincing other people that it's important is not easy, as you pointed out. Annalisa and Anne-Marie, over to you for your comments about the challenges that you're facing.
Yeah, so I'm interested in actually what Mo had talked about in terms of those strong urban and rural like linkages. I think there's some conversation to be had there. But here in Montreal, one of the interesting things in terms of actually both a strength and a weakness in terms of, and a challenge, if you will, in relation to operating at the regional level is that we have a very strong local civil society engagement. And historically, as well as currently within the city of Montreal, as well as within the region of Montreal. And that has been a real benefit because, the CSAM has engaged with over 200 organizations to actually build the capacity in order to actually do some food systems transformation. But there's also some, to a certain extent, resistance, if you will, on the level of the neighborhood or the local at times in terms of actually not wanting to be taken over by a regional actor and being suspicious to a certain extent of that tamping down on or violating their sovereignty in terms of actually their capacity to operate independently at the local level. And then in relation to that, there's also some concern about scaling up in terms of the lessons learned and to a certain extent, a concern about respect for the insights coming from local actors and their capacities to scale up. And so there needs to be a strong, and I've heard this from local organizations consistently, what we need is support actually from the regional level to scale up and not somebody coming in and telling us what to do. So that's part of it. The second I would say in terms of actually, and I'd be interested in a conversation about this, is the political process and the political context in which we operate. The CSAM has the mandate associated with their work from the city of Montreal. But as everybody knows, elections happen. We just had an election for the municipality. And that election is up in the air in terms of how supportive the political actors are going to be within our context of the work associated with regional scale work, as well as the support associated with food policy for the city of Montreal, and their support and voice like in the urban context to actually support regional actors.
Yeah, thanks, Annalisa, for speaking out on behalf of the community actors. I think that it's hard to integrate their voices. It's hard to resource them properly so that they can have a space at the table. So those are really important considerations. Rachel and Maureen, you get the last word, and then we hand it over to Anne.
Thanks, Alison. I think the question of challenges is a really interesting one, and I think we have a few here in Melbourne. I think one of our key challenges of working regionally in terms of the food system is governance. So the lack of existing governance structures for working regionally across local or municipal government boundaries. So unlike many cities, we don't have metropolitan-wide governance or a metropolitan-wide Food Council or Alliance here in Melbourne. That's a real challenge for us. It was one of the main reasons that we established the Foodprint Melbourne project back in 2015 as a way to bring inner urban municipal governments together with peri-urban governments to think about Melbourne's food system at a more regional level, and also to enable them to collaborate to develop common vision and strategies and to advocate up to Victorian state government for action to strengthen the regional food system. Which, of course, is one of the benefits of working regionally, this ability to advocate up. I think another key challenge is just who speaks for the region. So who speaks for the region, who acts for the region, including taking those kind of strong policy or legislative steps that are needed to strengthen regional food systems, such as, strong protection for farmland around cities. It's one of the fundamental kind of building blocks of a strong regional food system. Local governments here really want to protect that farmland, particularly local governments in the peri-urban fringe of Melbourne, but they are dependent on state government taking strong action to do that. And I think also just a mapping and data challenge about the regional food system. So, what does the regional food system look like? How much food grows locally? How much of that food actually comes into the city? We've had a lot of data challenges understanding that. How much food and organic waste is at regional levels being processed and recycled back on farm? How much of the city's wastewater is being reused on farm? So there's a kind of whole mapping challenge around the regional food system as well. Don't know if Maureen's got anything else to add there.
Oh, just exactly, Rachel, in terms of who speaks for the region, like municipal elections are won and lost on local issues. State government elections are won and lost on state issues, whereas the region is the missing middle. So there's actually no sort of even like electoral process that underpins regional level governance.
Well, those are excellent observations about some of the challenges that we face, and you're throwing down the gauntlet for more conversations within our Flow partnership. So we've got lots of good work cut out for ourselves. And I invite you now to give us some summative comments.
So this was really, really fascinating for me to listen to, because I found there are some things that are very similar to the US context and in terms of what we're working on. And I was looking at it from farmland protection, we call it preservation in the States, and it can happen at the county level in the US, but it is often, like, I live in a state that has the most liberal farmland preservation laws, and it was like a smart growth initiative. I live in Maryland, and but that's unusual. And a lot of our food policy councils do not organize around farmland preservation. But you will see like regional councils responding more to those types of issues because they're beyond political boundaries. I've heard that many times, like, this is not really about political boundaries. We have our regional councils are also representing mostly like processing and production in a much more proactive way than we find councils that are working at the city level. And so I was really fascinated to hear about just how, the challenges between, are you talking, is it going to be focused on egg? Is it going to be focused on hunger? Hunger oftentimes takes center stage, especially when you're having a crisis like the pandemic, or we had like SNAP disbenefit, drop off. And I think sometimes that takes the oxygen out of the room to look at more systemic causes and to start to address it with using more systems thinking approaches of like, how are we going to look at this as a problem that is affecting us across many different sectors? And how do we get those sectors to kind of talk together and develop relationships so they can start to work on some of these issues? We don't have a lot of, I'd say we have there's some water, there's some climate change things that happen, but regional, I did hear this like difficulties about structures. Where do you find governance to be able to work on regional issues? And that is a real challenge for us as well. And I think that's probably why we don't see as many of our food policy councils, which is mostly my background, trying to organize at the regional level. We have about 47 as of like 2 days ago. We're wrapping up our survey out of over like 330. So it's not a huge number, but it is still significant. And there's an acknowledgement that they need to be working beyond those political boundaries. I was really fascinated too by people talking about, the district, like this school food, and like where does this happen? Like you have the agency to even act on some of these issues, and I think that is a big challenge. There are, we in the county level, most school districts are operating at the county level in the states. So states are made up of counties. We have 24 in Maryland. So there is some decision making, but we have to follow federal law, right? So you have some autonomy, but it is limited. And I think that piece of it, is, it's good to acknowledge where you have influence and where you don't. And so you're not spending a lot of time in the areas that you really aren't going to be able to change. Like, how do you stretch those boundaries to really make more significant impact and think about what you can do? The shocks and stresses of listening to Australia talk and some of the others about just being more vulnerable with climate change. And oftentimes I think humans are prone to not making changes until we have to, unfortunately. And so getting people to think proactively about that and to think about a region versus just your political boundaries, I think is really critical. And I was on a regional project, that was 12 states. And it was like, how do people conceptualize their region? And it was everything. This was a USDA funded project. It was everything from like their neighborhood, I'm not kidding, and to like, like multiple states. So there was no agreement or acknowledgement of what constitutes a region. So you all kind of seems like bioregions was a really strong theme that I heard. And that is a good sign, because I feel like it also means there's an identity that comes with that. And so you're appealing to that identity. And then how do you kind of create that identity so the government starts to appreciate that, even though it's beyond their areas of influence sometimes, right? It's not just the political boundaries. You really do need to, you get them on board to be able to say, how are we going to work in this space together? That they don't get a lot of rewards for cooperating sometimes. And so I think, showing what those rewards are can be, and what are the wins that they get if they start to think differently about how they approach their work. Let me see what else. There was, I think this is Montreal, but it was like talking about the scales. This is always, I think, a tension as well. And I think it's like in the States, most of the food, we have a global food system. Most of our food is not coming from the local area or the region. And even if you created a 12, state region, we had very, very small percentage that was being distributed throughout the region, grown and distributed. So if you think about building the themes around infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure, I think is critical, because in the States, people are saying like, okay, we're going to increase this by 10%. Like, what can we opt out of in terms of the global food system that makes sense for our region? We're not going to grow everything. I feel like we're always going to be in a global food system. I don't really want to give up coffee. I could if I had to, but that is not my, it's like there's certain things that are going to be hard to do. We may end up in a situation where we can't get those things. But I think the piece of it that I think is important is that it is identifying what you can do and then saying, okay, let's, what is possible? Like, who do we need to be talking to at these different scales? Because I think sometimes the scales aren't communicating. So the people at the local area, don't necessarily know who's farming at the regional area, because maybe they're organized around a different theme or something. Like, we have states that, they're butting up to each other, and it's much easier for Maryland farmers to work with Pennsylvania farmers sometimes than it is to go further down in the state. So there are cultural and geographic reasons to do that. And so I think building that infrastructure so you have those opportunities to increase the amount of regional food that's being grown and distributed in your region is really important. And I think I heard the themes about investments in that, and like how to, we can get investments. There's money that comes from it. I think it was Australia said the funding streams are regionally based. I think that's pretty unusual, but I think that is a fantastic way to approach it, because it acknowledges that it's there needs to be an acknowledgement that that's an important scale at which to work for food systems. I'm trying to think. There's more. I took a ton of notes, but I don't know.
Well, you've got a couple more minutes, but we're happy to throw it open, whatever you prefer, Anne.
Let me see. No, I think that is about covers it. I mean, I'm happy to talk more about the US stuff. I wasn't sure if it was commenting on some of the similarities to the US and also just taking a bunch of notes and hearing what you all were doing. So,
well, why don't we open it up with the proviso that Anne can only be with us for another 9 minutes. So does anyone on the panel have any comments back to Anne or anything that they'd like to say to her before she gets going? And I just have one thing to say. You rightly slapped my wrist about the coffee. I think we need to obviously have global trade for certain things that we can't produce within our regional food system, and that those things should be fairly traded. So yeah, absolutely. So I sit corrected. Thank you, Anne. Does anybody from the panel have any comments about what Anne said, or should we just open it up to the Q&A? Rachel?
Yeah, I just got one reflection. I think the point you made, Anne, about just the importance of recognizing regional as being an important scale at which to work in food systems. I mean, I do think that's quite fundamental because it speaks to the lack of governance structures a bit. It speaks to the lack of data. So, for instance, here in Australia, we have fantastic data about our food exports because we're focused on food exports. We've been trying for over 10 years now to find out how much food comes from the fringe of Melbourne into the city. There just isn't the data, or not the publicly available data. There's no publicly available data about how much wastewater is recycled and reused in the region. We don't see it as important, and therefore we're not reporting on these issues, and we don't have the governance structure. So I do think it's fundamental to be just recognizing the importance of regional and advocating for that, and then other things potentially flow from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. And it's really one of the points of the Flow Research Project is to get at the crux of this, because one of the things that we've realized going into this process is that there's a need for evidence to substantiate why the regional scale is so important and what it has to offer. And that's really one of the key contributions of the Flow project, running over 7 years and collecting data along the way. So that's one of the contributions we hope to make. But I hear you, Rachel, in terms of getting access to that data about food flows within a region. It's really hard. It's very challenging for sure. Well, thanks, Anne, as you need to take off, for being with us. Much appreciated. So what I'm going to do now is turn our attention to some of the questions that we've got in the chat. Mo, I beg your pardon. Did you have a comment while Anne's still with us? Go ahead.
Well,
I didn't see your hand. My bad.
Okay. That's okay. I just put it up. It's to build upon what Rachel said, which is, and it's to bring in Seema's contribution and question in the chat. So the data that I also think is missing, and I'm curious if this is in other countries, but for Indigenous Territories Canada, part of that data is also the types of investments that have been made into export-based agriculture and into local regional infrastructure and agriculture. And I think that over decades, if we can get that data, it would demonstrate a disproportionate investment. And we need that data to understand the question about what feeds the world. If a country has invested into export-based agriculture for decades, then the systems that we have will be understood and relied upon that have been built over those decades. And so what I find difficult without having proper data is to understand that sentence about what feeds the world. Is it our global trade environments? Is it the region? Alison, you identified the need for both. I think all of us understand the need for both, but the disproportionate amounts in our communities of what is able to be grown for local eaters versus what is grown has to also include that understanding of what investments have been made over time to lead to this sort of common narrative that I don't think is true in our regions. All of our regions can produce more for our own eaters. Thanks.
Yeah, Absolutely. And there was an interesting study in Ontario that compared food production in the 1950s and food processing in the 1950s in Ontario with the 1980s. It's quite old, that study, but there was a complete shift. So we have been more self-sufficient in some ways and have been moving in the direction of more globalized food systems, as we all know. I'm going to turn to a question in the chat from Sandy Mark. And that is, how can regional food systems grow in the face of the dominant industrial food system and its grip on national policy? So speaking exactly to Mo, to what you were just saying, and I think somewhat to what Rachel was alluding to, many regions only have a few days food in those regions. And if the global food supply chain fails, which has been happening more lately and will probably not change, where does this leave us? And I guess COVID helps us to understand the answer to that question a little bit too, as our food supplies were under threat and food systems became more regional during that time. So I don't know if there's anybody on the panel that would like to pick up that question. If you need to see it again. Yeah, Anne-Marie, go ahead.
Sure. I'm not going to speak necessarily to the failing of the global supply chain, but I think one thing that's interesting to point out, I think it was Kent who was mentioning earlier that sometimes it's hard to get different levels of government to work together, and especially when at the state level, like when Anne was speaking about the state level, these kinds of government structures that are kind of ossified. At the same time, when you look at the food systems work that we're doing on the regional level, it's very far from being isolated, because when we're working on that level, I don't know, I mean, maybe this exists, but everybody who seems to be working on a regional food system level is connected to the other regions in their province, in their state, across their country, and around the world through projects like this, through other existing networks. Someone had a question about the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. Like these, it seems to me that there's a counterbalance to the global food system through these networks of the regional food systems who increasingly are learning from each other, working together, and hopefully building greater influence.
Yeah, thanks, Emery. I think you raise a good point in terms of solidarity and knowing that other people are doing the same thing and we all can learn from each other. There is a follow-up almost question to what you were just saying, Emery, about the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact from Amy Carad. And it's directed specifically at Trish. They're wondering if you could speak to the process of getting the sign-off to the Milan Pact and what benefits it has had. Has it opened up opportunities or leverage points, actions, policies that didn't seem possible before? Thanks.
Allison,
Trish?
I'll let Mo answer because she's provided a really good answer to that, to Amy's question in the chat.
Oh, my bad. Okay, I missed the answer. Sorry. Mo, can you share with everybody in case
Sure.
people...
Yeah, just that we're interested in it. The sign-on requires you to be a community over 100,000 people. It requires your mayor to sign on, and it requires the application just to indicate what your community is already doing, and as in your local government, and what your local government plans to do. And so there are over 300 cities that have signed the Milan Urban Food Pact. One of the things that we're interested in is we think it can raise local food systems literacy among local government. It provides your local government an opportunity to learn from other local governments on what they're doing, which can also be a motivating and innovative factor. And there's an indicator framework that has been put together from communities, including Toronto was one of the ones that participated in the international framework indicator piece that they've released with that. So that could help your community to customize either a new or updating a food strategy at the local government level.
Thanks very much, Mo. That's very detailed. Kent, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think one of the biggest challenges that we have in advancing any sort of alternative food system, regional or otherwise, is that people they don't believe that you can build an alternate economy. They are hammered every day that GDP growth based on a neoliberal transnational economy is the only way you can build a functional economy. And I think that that's one of our challenges is to get people to understand that the economy is of our construct, and it is supposed to support and advance the well-being of society. And we've defaulted to the notion that creating wealth through this neoliberal global economy is the only way you can do that, and that is patently false.
Thanks, Kent. That's an important contribution for sure, that we need to shift away from our preconceived notions about what the economy should do for who, and who it should be serving. And same with politics. So we have a question from Geetha Kamaran. She's curious to know if there's any forms of, or they're curious, beg your pardon, to know if there's any form of winter farming happening in the regions that are presented here. So are there alternative forms of farming that anybody's aware of that would give us more access to different kinds of food throughout the year, I guess? And Elisa, yeah, please go ahead.
I'll just mention one that Anne Marie is fully aware of is we do have Lufa Farms, which actually is what they have done, which I think is been a big contribution, is actually develop greenhouses on the rooftops of large buildings and have started growing food in those greenhouses. And they do, thank you, Trish. So Trish put the link to the Lufa Farms in the chat, and it's actually been a good model. There have been some issues with the rollout of Lufa Farms, but they have been like fairly effective at actually bridging that local and international connection. Like you can get stuff from the region from Lufa, but a lot of their work is actually focused on growing throughout the year in greenhouses on the rooftops of mostly commercial buildings, and that has been fairly effective. It's a bit more expensive to get to the cost component of this, and I think there's some discussion around a need to think about that cost for the average consumer, as well as what access points are available to people who want to take up that option. Lufa basically grows stuff on the rooftops within Montreal, and then has points of access at various locations around the city, and so you can go pick up your basket, or they can deliver their basket to you, but you have to order a basket.
Thanks, Annalisa. Does anybody, that's an important example for sure. And I know it's not without controversy in some respects, but it is a really excellent example of alternative growing. Any other examples from cold? Okay. All right. So Mo, you've given us
I just gave a few other ones that the one that might be of interest is on seeds. There's some work to try and breed regional seed that can then grow in lower temperatures, so that it allows not season extension only through tunnels and greenhousing and such, but within the seed itself.
Thanks very much, Mo. Okay. I'm having a hard time curating all the questions. I lost one along here. Hang on a second. There was Doug Jones. There we go. This will be something that you will probably want to respond to, Kent. Competition from offshore food imports is a significant impediment for local food systems, as we've been saying. Federal policy is hampered by not wanting to raise food costs by limiting imports. Do you see any way to manage the competing interests of cheap food versus local food?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think that what we really need to do is be more transparent in the cost of cheap food. So, for example, while we espouse all the money that consumers save with our cheap food policy, we fail to recognize that Western food-related disease is epidemic and is breaking the healthcare bank in Canada and the U.S. And so we've got to start engaging in some true cost accounting. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Ken. I don't know if anybody else has any other comments about that, but I think the externalities need to be brought into the cost calculation equation, including loss of biodiversity and ecosystem, water contamination, all the things that social impacts, different communities that we have in our various countries being impacted differently. There's many, many things to consider when we're thinking about the cost. How do you define cost? Maybe we should do a webinar on that. And Doug Jones has just said Nova Scotia school programs want to grow at least some of their food in greenhouses. So maybe they can reach out to folks in Montreal, Doug, and find out more about that. Are there any other comments that the panelists would like to share about the comments that they've heard or the questions that we've been thinking about so far together? If not, I wonder if we can think about some of the things. One of the things that's come up in conversation is the need for, at the regional scale, more of the infrastructure. Yeah, Trish, go ahead.
It's just a general comment that's kind of percolating to the top of my consciousness now. For all of us, the pendulum has swung so far in one direction towards a globalized food supply chain. We've lost so much local productive capacity, so much of the missing middle of the infrastructure, the value-added processing infrastructure. And I think that the antidote to that is necessarily the regional scale. It can't just be the uber local scale. It's got to be those local scales agglomerated at that regional. And something that Rachel said about regional resilience mitigating vulnerability really stuck with me. I may have reformulated your words, Rachel, but I think that was the sentiment there. And so I really do think we're on to something with the regional scale being the antidote to the precarities of the global supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's a great and that's why we're here, right? Is to talk about the regional scale and why it's so valuable. And we have lots of work ahead of us to figure out the answers to those questions. And I think some of the ingredients have been proposed in terms of rebuilding or building the infrastructure that's needed, the food hubs that several people have mentioned, but also things like public procurement is also something that happens in many different countries around the world, and especially through school feeding programs that link farmers directly to local food programs, either sort of the mush, so the different governments, universities, hospitals, and schools. Those are other opportunities for making the food system more regionalized and more territorialized. We have a comment from a person. It's actually a suggestion about a future webinar that we can take on board to think about thinking about how this costing actually works out and looking at those factors. So that's something that we can consider for a future webinar. Rachel, please go ahead.
Thanks, Alison. And I just want to respond to a comment from Mo there, but also was a question here, and I think I might just have lost that question. I think it was from Seema about that we haven't responded to yet, just about what grows around our regions. I just want to respond perhaps to both those points. In relation to what Mo said, I think one of the things that we're learning from Melbourne is it is about the story, the narrative, like how we reframe policy problems for government in terms of why regional is so important, and focusing on telling those stories together. One of the stories that we began telling in Melbourne around the need to protect farmland was exactly in relation to that question from Seema about what actually grows around the region and why it is so important. Food was something that we saw as growing out in rural areas, not as something that we saw as growing around a city. So one of the things that we did here was just to map and get some data on what actually grew around the fringe of Melbourne and what we call our food bowl or our city region food system, what we discovered through that was that actually around half of the vegetables that were grown in the state of Victoria were growing on the fringe of the city. That's important because we're one of the two main horticultural states in the country. So the fact that actually a significant proportion of vegetable production was coming from that region and it was at risk of urban development was part of telling that story about why thinking about food at regional level is so important and why thinking about food around cities is so important and starting to reframe the way that farmland protection was seen. Why is it important? It's important, particularly important in the context of, food security for growing city populations in the context of climate change and the need for fresh food production. So kind of reframing why regional is so important from that point of view and in the context of these vulnerabilities that we're talking about as well.
Yeah, Rachel, you're raising a really good point. There seems to be a disconnect that needs to be rebuilt. I think Mo is saying this between the rural and the urban. There needs to be more linkages so that the at least in my estimation, so that the act of growing food is valued and seen, and we've lost that in so many ways. People go to the grocery stores and they don't know where their food comes from anymore, and that's definitely a challenge to talking about regional food systems, is reconnecting people with their food sources. Yeah, and Annalisa, please go ahead.
I think it's also important that we because what I'm hearing about is building infrastructure, and I really appreciate your comments, Rachel, in terms of actually reevaluating some of those connections, because I think to a certain extent, we have perhaps, especially in urban areas, forgotten some of those connections that we once had and recognize that some of the infrastructure is still there. So one of the initiatives I've worked with, Montreal used to be covered with greenhouses, and they did a lot of growing locally in those greenhouses. And as the transition has happened to a more globalized food system, many people presumed that all of those initiatives and those efforts were dismantled, when in fact, in a couple of the neighborhoods in Montreal, there were greenhouses that just went dormant. One of the places that was in one of the neighborhoods, the city was storing equipment in one of the greenhouses. And we figured out that was actually a greenhouse, and petitioned the city to say, actually, can that be taken back to actually grow food again? You're just using it to actually store equipment for people who are working in the parks. Why is that being used for that particular purpose? Can we actually reclaim that space? And so I think some of it is also reclaiming the space that was already there. And to do that, actually understanding and mapping what the initiatives were, or maybe having a longer term kind of perspective on where we've come from as well as where we're going.
Yeah, I think this idea of disconnection is really important when we're thinking about regional, because we need to, and it's problematic because in some ways people don't want to go back to where we came from, and they see it as old fashioned or whatever, going back to the food systems that we had before. But these connections are important because they mean that we have a better understanding of the challenges that farmers are facing, which are huge right now in the context of climate change, especially. And I think that those are important things for people to get their heads around. Things like community gardens. I know Montreal is one of a bastion of community gardens in Canada, and those are amazing opportunities for linking people back to their food systems and letting them know what some of the challenges are with growing a tomato or growing lettuce or growing food for themselves. There's an interesting question that came up in the chat about the competition. And I think this was what you're referring to, Rachel, from SEMA, about what's grown. So even though we have agricultural activity in the hinterlands or the urban and peri-urban areas around cities, are they growing commodities for export, or are they growing food for local sources? And I think, Rachel, as you were alluding to, we need to get our heads around that. Can everybody hear me? My headphones just, okay, cool. My earbuds just failed. Yeah, so I think that those are all important considerations that we need to look into and dig into a little bit through future research for flow. Kent, I think you had your hand up, and then I'm going to give everybody 1 minute to wrap up, and we'll be
I did. I just wanted to make mention of, and we haven't emphasized it, that building regional food systems has tremendous economic development potential. We all know that concentration in the food system has resulted in most of the wealth from agriculture and the food system going to a few corporate interests. And we all know that our many of our national economic policies are uh, creating the greatest disparity of wealth um, uh, dispersal that we've seen in a long, long time. Building regional food systems has great potential of bringing the food economy back home and creating wealth within a community that magnifies through the community. And I think economic development is a really strong argument to garner support for regionalizing food systems.
You're getting a thumbs up, Kent, from James in Toronto. I think there's a really interesting comment that points us to Linda Best's work out east in terms of community development finance programs. And if you're not familiar with the work that's been happening out east, it's excellent. It's a different model for financing food systems using people's retirement investment plans as a stimulus for investment in local initiatives. And it's really worth looking at. You can check it out at farmworks.ca, I believe is the URL. So thank you, Sandy, for pointing that out. And thanks to Linda for all her amazing work. I think maybe what we'll do is give each region 1 minute to wrap up, or 30 seconds actually. But before we do that, in case people get cut off, I'd just like to shout out to everybody who participated on the call. Thanks for all of your amazing comments. Thanks so much to our panelists. You've been awesome. And thanks also to Liz and Chuchita for the technical support. We wouldn't have done this without you. So we'll start with Australia. Go up. What would be your closing comment or observation?
Yeah, I think a closing observation just being at the potential of working regionally in terms of building alternatives to that kind of food system that most food currently comes from, and we're aware of the challenges with, and to do that in a way that really meets the needs of the people living and working in our regions and the things that they care about. And that is in terms of what Ken said before about livelihoods, and also just ensuring that everybody in our regions has access to healthy, sustainable food, and that we are, addressing food insecurity and hunger, etc., at the same time as we're doing that.
Thanks, Rachel. Annalisa, do you have anything, or Anne-Marie, to add to that?
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to share back is that what I find really interesting in the conversation we've been having today is that it's so clear in our minds that we're building an alternative and that our greatest challenge is the global food system as it exists. And I know a lot of people share that perspective. However, in our network, and especially with a lot of the partners that we work with who are in government or in small business or in any sector, really, community, population, that's not necessarily obvious to them. So the problems, the structural problems of the globalized industrial food system, while people are vaguely aware of them, and there's sort of a goodwill towards the idea of improving things, it's really hard, I think, to get people to take the next step and recognize we cannot keep things as they are. So, and that the work that we're doing is part of an effort to really confront that reality. So I think it's great to hear that there's many people who see that clearly, and I think one of our challenges to make that a more broadly accepted perspective.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Trish and Mo, Trish or Mo, do you have a final word?
Thanks, Allison. I just want to build upon what Kent started and what's been continuing in terms of the economic development potential in regional food systems, with a story that is to say that at one point we worked with a local processor to develop a organically grown in our region oatmeal package that met the school food requirements and had it all set up. And it was at a cost that was lower than what was being purchased through the systems at place. And what we're talking about in terms of believing this is possible, public procurement is absolutely a lever we need to use. The vision that what does grow in our region and that we can make economic development choices that will benefit our whole region, including those who would be seeking more sustainable livelihoods within the food system. And so I believe very strongly in the potential, the economic potential that exists right now in our communities.
Thanks for that upbeat note, Mo. And over to you, Kent. You get the last word.
Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work and thinking. I'd like to finally say that we're now focused substantially on public citizen engagement. We believe that awareness of what needs to happen and why it needs to happen, and and building a vision of what's actually possible is really critical in advancing regional food systems. I don't think that this is a top down going to happen top down. It's going to be grassroots up, and so we've got to move beyond the choir substantially
Yes.
and really engage people broadly. They need
Yes.
they need to have the confidence that they can take back their economy
Mm.
and their future.
Well, with those inspiring words, I'd like to point out that our panel is composed of both community partners and academic partners. So we're trying to walk the walk. And I'm really grateful to all of you for doing the amazing work that you're doing in your communities and with your across the partnership. And thanks to everybody who participated today, and have a lovely rest of your day. And we have another webinar coming up, and we'll let you know about that through our network. So thanks so much for being here. And thanks again to Liz and Shuchita. Take good care, everybody. Thank you.